All right, so with this section, we have a lot going on, and this is a really kind of severe, sharp left turn where we've really been concentrating on religion and the different religious ideas and religious developments globally. Now we're going to start to deal with something that, in a lot of ways, is the opposite of religion. And this is going to be the growth of science. There's going to be this reliance on reason and logic, where faith and religion, especially of earlier periods, is going to rest more upon blind faith. So we have a lot of highlighting, handful of notes. Some of this stuff within the scientific revolution should be somewhat familiar to you. So we're going to kind of, build off of that and riff on it. So the scientific revolution was an intellectual and cultural transformation that occurred between the mid 16th century and the early 18th century. It's important to note, and you want to put a star by the unlabeled sentence here, that it flowed out of the Renaissance. It flowed out of the Renaissance. This concentration that the Renaissance had on secular ideas, like anything that wasn't religious, is going to feed into the scientific revolution. And one of the things that you have with a couple of these intellectual movements is that they flow from one into another. Like the other intellectual movement that we'll deal with in this chapter is going to be the Enlightenment, and it's going to use a lot of the same concepts of the use of reason and logic that the scientific revolution did. But the Enlightenment, rather than looking at, why does an apple fall from a tree, it's going to look at the dynamics of government and how people should behave and react. You also want to make sure we keep highlighting here is the scientific revolution was based upon careful observation, controlled experiments, and the formulations of general laws to explain the world. Again, this is the exact opposite of what, especially the Roman Catholic Church, where they're believing that all knowledge is coming from the Bible. Its creators of the movement see themselves as making a radical departure. In fact, you want to put down here next to two, because there's going to be a little bit of kind of intellectual conflict. And this is where we will definitely start to depart from the Renaissance. That even though the scientific revolution flows out of the Renaissance, we're going to start to separate ourselves from the ideas of the Renaissance. But next to number two, you want to put that they sensed that they were quote unquote moderns, combating the quote unquote ancients, and then in parentheses put the Romans and the Greeks. If you remember from forever ago with the with the Renaissance rather, that the Renaissance was a rehashing, an imitation of what the Greeks and the Romans did. We're now in the scientific revolution. These intellectuals, these scientists, believe that they have moved beyond what the Greeks and Romans did, that they're finding flaws in Greek and Roman scientific thought, and that they're working to fix it. They're working to improve. The scientific revolution, of course, is going to be vastly significant. I mean, the big one, and you want to put a star because there's a list, and the list is on in total on my page, but it's going to be on 2 pages for you. So you want to put a star there by A, put a big star, and then we'll put another star by the rest of the list at the top of the next page. But the first thing it's going to do is that it fundamentally alters the idea about the place of humankind within the cosmos. This is going to be the whole creation of the heliocentric model of the solar system, or the sun-centered uh, model of the solar system. And then you want to go and put uh, a big star here on top of your page 7 by B, C, D, and E. I mean, it will, and this is definitely going to be an issue. It challenged the teachings and the authority of the church. The church had always been the sole source of knowledge and truth, and now you have scientists who are calling shenanigans on the church. It challenged the ancient social hierarchies and political systems. We're breaking away from wanting to imitate the Greeks and the Romans. It also was used to legitimize racial and gender inequality. This is going to be something that we'll be building on later, especially with social Darwinism, where they're going to use pseudoscience, false science, to justify not only gender roles, but also to justify and institutionalize racism. By the 20th century, science had become the chief symbol of modernity around the world. We talked about this at the beginning of the chapter, that in order to be a modern nation, you have to have an adoption of modern scientific thought. Now, we have a question as to why Europe, because let's face it, and I told you this before, up until we get the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 1750s, Europe is at best, at the latter part of this period, kind of catching up to everybody else. But they're going to be the ones that have this scientific revolution, and the others don't. I mean, even though the Islamic world had some amazing, and China had some amazing developments in the period that comes before this, like before 1450, they don't keep that up. Um, there are some conditions that are uniquely favorable in Europe to the rise of science. One, there's the evolution of a legal system that guaranteed independence for a variety of institutions by the 12th and 11th centuries. That you had institutions, namely universities, that were able to operate without political or, in some cases, religious interference. They were kind of their own and could do, their own thing. And again, this is going to be autonomy or independence of these emerging universities. You want to put down here next the C underneath number 3, that universities became zones of intellectual autonomy. I said that a little fast. So, universities became zones of intellectual autonomy. It means that the people operating, the intellectuals, the scientists, the thinkers within these universities could operate without anybody mucking about with them. They didn't have to worry about the church coming in and go, we don't do that. They don't have to worry about the monarch or the government coming in going, we don't do that. So it's like, it's an intellectual free zone, in other words. Where in the Islamic world, science remains mostly outside the system of higher education. It's almost kind of like a for hire scientist or a for hire intellectual. There isn't this collaborative vibe that we see within the European universities. And in China, the authorities simply didn't permit independent institutions of higher learning. Chinese education is focused on preparing for the civil service exams. So, unless it's in the civil service exams, it's not taught. So, because of this, the emphasis was on classical Confucian text and looking in regards to science. You want to put down here next to B underneath number 5, science was marginalized. Put down next to B here underneath number 5, science was marginalized. It's not important to the civil service examination system. It's not really found within the classical Confucian text, which of course makes up the civil service exam. So we just aren't going to bother with it. In the 16th through the 18th centuries, the Europeans were at the center of a massive new information exchange. This is going to be where we overlap with the age of discovery. There's so much new information coming in about new places, new things, new food, new plants, new animals, new everything, that there is this obsession with the gathering of information. And key to this, like I said, and you want to put down here next to 7, is that this is tied to the age of discovery. It kind of creates this culture, this obsession with gaining as much knowledge as humanly possible. There's also going to be science as a cultural revolution here, where dominant educated European view of the world before the scientific revolution was deprived from derived rather from Aristotle and Ptolemy. So Greeks and Greeks and Romans or Hellenistic thinkers, they're going to believe that the earth was stationary and at the center of the universe. Again, that's where Ptolemy comes in. And that we have a universe of a divine purpose. Specifically, you want to put down here next to C underneath number one that the church like this. The church like this. And in fact, you want to put a star up by number one here as well, because you're going to see that this is going to come up later on in a couple questions, especially in the review. Now, the initial breakthrough, of course, was done by Nicholas Copernicus. You all have known about him, where he published on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. You want to put down here next to A, underneath number two, that it was published after his death. He knew that this book and his findings were going to get him into trouble. We're going to get him to have some issues with the Roman Catholic Church. So he doesn't release this until he's dead. Like part of his will is, oh, yeah, by the way, I have this book. Please publish it, but make sure I'm cold and 6 feet under before anybody sees this because otherwise, I'm going to be in a world of crap. And in his book on the revolution of heavenly spheres, he promoted the view that the earth and the planets revolved around the sun. Now, here's the thing, because this is going to be altered a little bit later. So you want to put down right here at the end of B, underneath number two, you just want to add in perfect circles. Just add that right here. So you kind of are almost finishing the sentence with in perfect circles because it's wrong. And a later scientist is going to show that it's wrong. We'll get to that here in a second. Other scientists, of course, are going to build on Copernicus's insight. Like, for example, Johann Kepler is going to demonstrate the elliptical orbits of planets. You want to put down next to B underneath number three that he questioned the perfection of heavenly bodies and discovered the moons of Jupiter and new stars. Kepler uses a lot of Copernicus's data, but it's not adding up. There's something wrong. So these perfect circles here that Copernicus was talking about were incorrect. And for Kepler, they're going to be elliptical orbits. We also have Galileo developing an improved telescope. The end of this is going to be Isaac Newton. He's going to be the final stage of the scientific revolution. In fact, that's what epigee means. You want to go ahead and underline epigee and then draw an arrow over to the side and just put down final stage because that's going to be what that word means. Help you out with the vocab here a little bit. So he goes, and of course, you should be a little familiar with him. He formulated laws of motion and mechanics. His central concept, of course, is going to be universal gravitation. And for him, natural laws are going to govern both the micro and the macro. In fact, this is going to be really impressive because Newton's laws of physics are going to go all the way down to nearly the subatomic level. And this is a guy who doesn't know that that level goes and even exists. By the time we get to Newton's death, educated Europeans have fundamentally different views of the physical universe. I mean, this is kind of almost like a before and after. So you want to put a star here by 5. They're going to see that the physical universe is not propelled by angels and spirits, but functioned according to mathematical principles. They're also going to see that the machine of the universe is self regulating, where you don't have, like according to the Roman Catholic faith or the Christian faith in general, you don't have the hand of God coming down and interfering, or the hand of God causing the operation or the operations of the universe. On top of this, not only are we looking at big things like the solar system, but we're also going to be looking at the human body, and that's going to become less mysterious. However, the Catholic Church is not going to be a fan of this. In fact, they're going to strenuously oppose much of this thinking. Like, for example, Galileo was forced to renounce his belief that the Earth moved around in orbit and rotated on its axis. You're going to have to flip in order to get the last part of that. But it's going to be important to note here that no early scientists rejected Christianity. None of these guys are going to be atheists. They're going to be deists, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. Guys, up at the top of the page, I just want to kind of have you put a note down here because this will kind of explain why the church is thinking this. So you should be up at the top of page 9. I know my pages look different from yours, but put this up at the top of page 9 and write down that the church and the Bible were previously thought of as the source of all knowledge. The scientific revolution questioned that. Now, out of the scientific revolution, we're going to get another movement. But before we get too far into this movement, I just want to make sure that we kind of have a basic understanding here. And you want to put down here next to capital C, and this is going to be something similar to what I said about the Renaissance, but I want to kind of reinforce that because it's been a while and we're kind of dealing with things that you have a little bit of knowledge about. But you want to put down here next to C that these intellectual movements are not for the consumption of the masses. Even though we have higher literacy rates than we had during the Renaissance because of the Reformation and the printing press and all this other sort of stuff, and we have more educated people, more literate people, these movements here, whether it's the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment, are really only for a small group of people. You have to be very well educated and wealthy in order to be participating in them and even to know about them. Again, not that much different from the Renaissance, like we talked about before. So the scientific revolution gradually reached a wider European audience. And the scientific approach here approach to knowledge was applied to human affairs. So, in general, you want to put down somewhere sort of kind of near number 2, and then I'll kind of explain it. The success of the scientific revolution's use of reason led people to apply it in other areas. In other words, because these scientists during the scientific revolution were so successful at using reason and logic to kind of discern what's going on in the physical world, you're going to have intellectuals and philosophers take that same idea, or those same ideas of reason and logic, and start to apply it to other things. Like, for example, we have Adam Smith formulating economic laws. This, by the way, and you want to put down, because we'll talk about this later, put this down next to A underneath number 2, his hands-off policy. What Enlightenment thinkers believe that they could do is that they could use knowledge to transform human society. In other words, and you want to put down here next to four, that they are very optimistic. They are very optimistic. They believe in people's capacity to use reason, to be logical. They believe that they can create a far better human society, one that is reasonable and one that is logical. These guys tended to be satirical, critical, and hostile to established authorities. They attacked arbitrary government, divine right, and aristocratic privilege, basically anything that's old school. They don't like anything that is kind of custom and tradition because for them, those ideas of custom and tradition don't hold up to the new light of logic and reason. One of the first to do this is John Locke, who articulated the ideas of a constitutional government. Much of the enlightened thought is going to is going to attack established religion, and one of the things that makes this so possible is one, the weakening of the Roman Catholic Church because of the Reformation, but also the scientific revolution's weakening of their stranglehold on knowledge and information. So we have this philosopher, Voltaire, who writes a treatise on toleration, and he attacks the narrow particularism of organized religion. He sees that organized religion, at least in his mind, go and does nothing but perpetuate hate and discontent and superstition. Many of these thinkers are going to be deists who believed in a remote entity who created the world but doesn't intervene. A really common analogy for the type of God that they believe exists. You want to put this down here next to B underneath number five. You want to put down God as a clockmaker. Like, for example, a clockmaker makes the clock, creates it, but the clockmaker doesn't come to your house every day and wind your clocks and set the time. So they kind of equate God in the same way, that God is the creator, but God, just like the clockmaker, doesn't interfere with their work or doesn't interfere with their creation on a daily basis, or if at all. The role of women in society and their education were also topics of debate. You want to put down here next to six that some thinkers advocated for women's education to make them better mothers, specifically to make them better mothers of sons. The argument is that the only reason why women need to be educated is because they will be the ones who do the first couple years of a child, particularly their son's education. And if they're not educated, they're not going to be able to create a solid educational foundation for those sons to build upon by private tutors, college, university, those types of things. Enlightened thought was also influenced by a growing global awareness. Again, keep in mind this is still the age of discovery. We are still making these global connections, and those global connections are going to impact how these guys are thinking and what they're thinking about. The central theme of the Enlightenment is the idea of progress, and this is a big deal. So you want to put a star by eight, and then you also want to put a little note here next to eight that the Enlightenment was forward thinking. The Enlightenment was forward thinking. If you remember, the Renaissance was backwards looking. We're going to look to the Greeks and the Romans on how to do things. We're going to imitate them. The Enlightenment doesn't want to do any of that. These guys are looking at how do we improve in the future. They see the past as basically BS, that it's old, it's antiquated. You can't hold it up to the light of reason and logic. So we need to get rid of it and create something better. Some thinkers, of course, are going to react against too much reliance on human reason. An example of this is going to be Rousseau, who argued for an immersion in nature rather than book learning. Rousseau's a little bit of a critter, to be honest with you. He kind of spans two intellectual movements. One is the Enlightenment, and the other one is the Romantic movement. And the Romantic movement is a lashing out against the obsession with reason and logic of the Enlightenment. So the Romantic movement appealed to emotion and imagination. We also kind of have this weird thing going on as well during the Enlightenment, also during the Romantic period, that we have these religious awakenings that made an immense emotional appeal. So while in some level we're attacking the superstition and the antiquated nature of religion, we also are having a little bit of religious revival going on here as well. I know, strange, but go with it. These guys are Europeans. So, looking ahead a little bit here, modern science is cumulative and also is self critical. What you have going on here in Europe is other scientists, other intellectuals working off of their fellow scientists and their fellow intellectuals. By the way, we do not have this within the Islamic world. The Islamic world, like I told you before, it's almost, a scientist for hire type of thing. So the relationship there is not going to be collaborative because what you discover is putting food in your belly. So in the Islamic world, these scientists are very competitive rather than cooperative as they are within Western Europe. This is going to grow on, and in the 19th century, science is going to be applied to all sorts of inquiry. And in some ways, it's going to undermine enlightened assumptions. Like it's going to obsess with reason and logic. However, some of the thinkers are going to stress other elements. Like, for example, Darwin is going to argue that life is always in flux, that there's no logic or reason to it. Marx is going to present human history as a progress of change and struggle. And then you also have Sigmund Freud, who simply cast doubt on human rationality. What we have going on here, and you want to go and draw like a little carrot here, because we want to kind of, bring together numbers 3, 4, and 5. And you just want to put over on the side next to that carrot that these thinkers stressed the struggle. These thinkers stressed the struggle, where the intellectuals in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, they're obsessed with reason and logic, and everything has to be held up to the light of reason and logic and have to apply reason and logic in order it to be something valid. You have Darwin, Marx, and Freud who are basically going and thumbing their nose at the concept of reason and logic. That, existence, that all life is constantly evolving and it's constantly in flux. Marx is going to argue that everything is a struggle, that all history is the history of human struggle. And Freud is going to say, oh crap, there's nothing reasonable about human beings. Now, beyond the West, and some of this I kind of have already talked about a little bit. Science became the most widely desired product of European culture. Guys, I'll put a star by number one here. It- we're going to see here in a couple chapters, once the Europeans start to expand again with the new imperialism in the 19th century, one of the things that attracts some of the people that they conquer to the Europeans is the fact that they have all this new stuff, all this latest and greatest stuff. And the people think, well, if we don't resist the Europeans, we can kind of take advantage their of their knowledge. You even see this early on here where the Chinese have a selective interest in Jesuit teaching. They don't like the religion that the Jesuits are pushing, but they like the other stuff. The Ottoman Empire is also going to choose not to translate the major European scientific works. However, there are some things that the Ottoman scholars are interested in. They're interested in things of practical utility, maps, calendars, that type of stuff. The other thing is that the Islamic education system was conservative and it made it very hard for theoretical scientists to do well. However, you want to put down here next to B, underneath number 4. In fact, you can kind of put it underneath in that space between B and on your notes between B and reflections. Do you want to put that the Ottomans greedily grabbed? It's a really good alliteration. The Ottomans greedily grabbed at European thought once they were in decline. And you'll see this in a couple chapters, and it's not just going to be the Ottomans, but once some of these empires go in decline, they have a holy crap moment. And they look at the Europeans who are like basically standing up at the top of Mount Awesome, and they're going, "Ooh, wait a second, let's grab everything that they have. Let's grab all the knowledge they have. Let's try to grab the technology. Let's try to make ourselves as much like them as we possibly can in order to save ourselves."